I suspect in Australia today, it would be very much easier to march under a hammer and sickle flag than it would a Nazi flag. And yet you could argue really that the hammer and sickle and everything it represents visited more misery on human beings than fascism did in the 30s and 40s.
I mean, keeping score isn't really the way to think about this, but certainly if you were keeping score, communism wins in terms of the number of violent deaths inflicted. That's because it had longer, of course. Fascist regimes were pretty much annihilated by 1945. But there's another important point which comes when you study totalitarianism, when you study different forms of totalitarianism, that the ideological differences are very profound. In the sense that the ideological foundation of Marxism-Leninism was a view of society derived from Marx's writings that divided us into classes, and our identities were essentially based on class, whereas the ideology of fascism was based on the race or the nation, the ethnic group. And I think we have an inclination to think that one is somehow worse than the other. But when you look at the practice of, say, Stalin's Soviet Union, that difference is much less obvious. For one thing, Stalin was perfectly prepared to regard class identity as hereditary. And if you were the son of a bourgeois or of a nobleman, then you were suspect by definition. So class became a hereditary attribute. Secondly, Stalin's Soviet Union persecuted people on the basis of nationality and race too. I mean, Stalin had his own pathological anti-Semitism in the later part of his life. So what seems like a clear distinction, and I've heard it made many times by academics on the left, that somehow fascism is worse because Marxism is based on class and fascism is based on race. On serious historical inspection, that distinction disappears, or at least it becomes much less meaningful. We don't want people to march under the swastika or the hammer and sickle. We don't want people in Hitler t-shirts. We don't want them in Marx or Lenin or Stalin t-shirts either. The most important thing to try to communicate to young people is that a free society is an incredibly precious thing, that the notion of individual freedom should be sacrosanct, and that both Marxism, Leninism and National Socialism repudiated the essential freedoms of the individual and on that basis committed hideous crimes. As I said, it's not just about the body count, it's also about the motive, and the fundamental motive of totalitarian ideologies is to destroy individual liberty.
So why, it seems to me then that the newfound resurgence of great interest in those sort of left-wing solutions to how we might organise ourselves would not be so attractive if we understood our own history so well. It seems to me that it's made it a lot easier because we seem to loathe our own cultural underpinnings. We want to detach ourselves from them. In fact, you'd almost argue we're becoming a cut flower society. We're removed from the plants that we were grown on, and if you like, and the soil in which we were nurtured. Why given our history, have we come to be so disparaging about our own culture?
Well, you mentioned Churchill a minute ago, and of course it was one of Churchill's cherished projects to write a history of the English-speaking peoples. It would probably get you at least disinvited from most major campuses. It's become quite hard to write about the history of the British Empire without being subjected to vilification. So there has been a pretty successful effort on the intellectual left to delegitimize the study of British and indeed European expansion. Now, for me this has always seemed strange because it's clear that one of the most important historical phenomena of the half millennium after around 1500 was the emigration of Europeans and their settlement all over the world, from North America to Australasia. And that's such an interesting phenomenon, we need to study it in all its complexity. And I've written a couple of books that deal with this issue, Empire and Civilization, books that take very seriously and document the bad things that Europeans did when they settled in other countries, the effects that their settlement had, both unintended and intended, on native populations. That's something that's not in any way whitewashed in my writing. But I also show that this process of expansion transformed the world in positive ways too. And a great deal of what we take for granted as the modern world today is a consequence of that period of European settlement. And Australia today is a very clear example of what happens when you transplant a civilization and you essentially establish it in a completely new setting. I don't think it would be possible to argue that this has been a net failure, a net disaster. There has been all kinds of ugliness along the way, but on balance, it seems to me clear that the benefits have outweighed the costs. Same goes for North America. Certainly, slavery remains a blot on the history of the United States of America. But that is not the only thing we should discuss when we're talking about the history of the most successful economy, and it could be argued the most successful democracy in history. The difficulty we have is that a subtle weighing of costs and benefits is not regarded as legitimate by people on the left, who will simply demonize you for talking about those benefits and insist that we must only talk about the costs. I was very struck by the fact that after the publication of Empire, which is now nearly 15 years ago, there really wasn't a reasoned debate in Britain. There was a sustained attack, often I thought by people who hadn't read the book, implying that the book was an apologia for imperialism, which it's not. It's a historical attempt to understand the phenomenon in both its good and bad respects. I found it very depressing that we couldn't have a serious debate about the costs and benefits of empire, and it turns out we still can't. An article was published recently in a scholarly journal by a young North American academic asking precisely this question. Rather to my mortification, he didn't cite my work, but that's okay. But he was more or less flayed alive for having written this. So we've essentially arrived at a situation in which we can't discuss this subject. And therefore, gradually it is accepted that it must all have been bad, and therefore we must all feel in some measure alienated from our roots, from Australia's roots, for that matter, from the roots of North America's societies. And that leads, I think, in turn, to this slightly exaggerated exaltation of other cultures and civilizations, and systematic denigration of anything that really could be associated with British or European expansion. It's a bizarre distortion of historical reality, but as an ideological achievement, you have to hand it to the left. They really have achieved their goal, which was to delegitimize the consequences of European expansion and to make people descended from European settlers feel ashamed of their roots.
Well, I think Marx observed that people derived of an understanding of their heritage are easily persuaded.
It's very clear that one way of winning the culture war is essentially to distort and skew the teaching of history. And I think people who lean to the right have been rather passive and perhaps naive in allowing this process to go so far that in not only universities but also in high schools, a version of the past is now taught that might as well have stamped on the back of it, made at the Institute of Marxism-Leninism or made at the Frankfurt School. The left has been very successful with its own imperialism, but what the left has done is to colonize universities and schools, colonize departments of education, establish colonies there, and then send out its missionaries to teach young people a version of events that might make sense in the context of Marxism-Leninism, but is in fact a complete and grotesque misrepresentation of the past.
Thank you for watching this episode. If you value vital conversations like this one, please like, share, subscribe, and join the conversation.